So Nile Rodgers here. I cannot believe that it's been 30 years since we did the Notorious album. Is it 30? What is it? Like a long time. One of the coolest things that I remember is every time we'd run into a problem, Nick Rhodes would always go, "What would Sly do?" So I started thinking about James Brown, and of course Nick said, "Nile, what would Sly do?" And I just started playing these James Brown riffs, and I just started going bing, bing, ding, diddle-ding, ding, 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 diddle-ding, very reminiscent of a James Brown groove. And what was cool about that is that harmonically, it's interesting because we're doing a minor 7 and a minor 13 chord, a minor 6 chord, or a 13, whatever you want to look at it. I look at it as a 13. And I had already had success playing that type of chord with David Bowie, with Let's Dance. So it felt really cool, like Duran Duran was now on this new sophisticated path. And I remember when I played it, to Nick's ears, he sort of perked up and was like, "Wow, Niall, what's that?" So I played it and I went over and I showed it to him on the piano. And he was like, "Dude, this is like the coolest thing in the world." And we were just jamming, and somehow it just came together. One of the coolest things about it is that after we got the song down and it was working and everything was cool, one of my favorite things is to do something at the top of a song to grab the listener's ear, right? So that you were hooked right away, I think. So when we started the song and it went, "No, no, notorious." Well, we were still in the days of making analog 2 tracks. And what we did was we measured the tape from one beat to the next. And by having that exact length, we cut the tape down the center line, and we flipped half of the tape backwards and the other half forwards. So when it got to the word notorious, the song went, "No, no, notorious." And it was a scary trick, but somehow it worked. When the guys heard it, they loved it. And to this very day, still one of my favorite records. Notorious.
When we first gathered together to make the Notorious album, we thought we had a 5-piece band still, because the plan was always after Arcadia and Power Station to come back together and make the next album. What actually happened was that Roger decided he wanted to be away from the music business for a while, and Andy had moved to sunny California, where he was making solo records. And so then there were 3. We realized we had to fill the musical gap of guitar and drums. So our first instinct was that we wanted to work with Nile Rodgers. And since he's not bad on the guitar, we asked, "Would you just play guitar on the project, Nile?" Of course, he was absolutely delighted. It has to be said, it doesn't take too much to push Nile into playing guitar. But he did a mighty fine job, and he brought a very different sound to the band. And then, in the absence of Roger, we just wanted to find the greatest drummer we could to fill that space for a while. We didn't realize how long at the time, but we headed towards Steve Ferroni, who had played with a lot of people, but specifically he was in the Average White Band for a while, and was just an extraordinary drummer. So when the 5 of us were in the studio together playing, for the 3 of us, we really had to take on board the different style that we were trying to develop, because we ostensibly wanted to make a Duran Duran funk record. And this was much easier for Niall and Steve than it was for us. But it was a fantastic education, and playing with different musicians of that standard and style was really pretty extraordinary. And out of that time, some great things came that were completely unexpected. I said to Steve Ferroni one day, "Why don't you ever program a rhythm box?" He said, "I don't need to, because I play the way I do. I don't need to program a rhythm box." I said, "Oh, okay." But then I think he realized that it was more of a challenge of what would you do to it. So there was one song on the album, American Science, when he decided he was going to sit down with a Lindrum and program it, and play with it, of course. He came up with one of those fantastic, irresistible rhythms, and I'd been listening a lot to the Sly and the Family Stone album, Fresh, which, if anyone still hasn't heard it, you certainly should. It's one of the finest records ever made for me, and I think for a lot of other people too. And I loved the way that rhythm boxes and drums were used on a few tracks on that album, so it was very much an inspiration for what we did, even though American Science is a very different sounding track than those on Fresh. But it was a very, very different musical landscape for us, having Nile and Steve pretty much be in Duran Duran for a while.
Well, I seem to remember that we got Nile in very early, and I was still trying to get Andy back on the project after Nile was involved. So I think Nile came. I mean, we got him on very early. We hadn't recorded a single note until Nile arrived, really, and we famously went with him. We started off at Abbey Road Studios in studio number 2, and famously couldn't get a drum sound that suited us, and then had to move to Air Studios in Oxford Street, which was wonderful. That's a great place to record. It's where we did our demos. It was a very nice studio to work in, with lots of great memories as well. So I don't think it was like, oh my God, Andy's not on the record, we better get Nile Rodgers in. It wasn't like that. We just thought he would be a really great kind of direction for Duran Duran to go in. I mean, John particularly he's got a very funky nerve in somewhere in that gawky body of his. There's some really funky cells, and he was the one who really pushed to get Nile, I think. Nick will probably claim that he did, but I think it was John. I was just happy to go along with anybody just to get some music down.
I don't remember at what point Nile got involved. We did quite a bit of work on the album before Nile got involved. I mean, Nick and I had started, we'd written, some music. We'd worked with Steve Ferroni, and then we'd taken the tracks to France, and we'd worked on the tracks there, and from there we came back to London, I think, and we brought Daniel Abraham back with us from Paris to engineer the sessions, and we came back to London, and I think that's where Nile started working with us. I do remember, by that point, we knew Andy wasn't going to be. By the time Nile started working with us, we knew that Andy wasn't going to be working with us. And I mean, that felt, that was like, the bad news is Andy's not going to be a part of it. The good news is we got Nile in the room. So that side of the guitar sound was going to be covered, but we were still, we were thinking out loud about about who could replace Andy in the band. I mean, funnily, I went to see Bob Dylan the other night, and I was watching Bob Dylan, and Charlie Sexton's playing guitar for Bob Dylan. I remember calling Charlie Sexton and asking him to join the band, and we asked Steve Stevens as well. And then I guess Warren was fairly he kept reaching out to us, and when we went to New York, that's where we met Warren, and we liked Warren immediately and connected over our references. And really the album was pretty much finished, but we found some spots that Warren could come in, just so really we could introduce him as the new guitar player.
I was in my car, I was living up in the countryside. I was pretty detached from the other members at that point. And I remember hearing this amazing record come on the radio. And it was Notorious with Nile and Steve Peroni. And I think it was a great record, I've got to say. And I was obviously always a fan of Nile Rodgers, but I was a big fan of Steve Peroni. I knew he's playing. I really knew he's playing well. So to hear him sitting with Duran was quite incredible, actually. And whenever we play that song live today, I have to I summon up my inner Steve Peroni for that song. And it was a great drum track, and I love playing it.
So now, try and put yourself in my place as a musician, as a producer, and a fan and a friend of the band. So I come in to do the Notorious album after we just had huge success. I mean, I had just worked on, a few months before, I had worked on The Wild Boys, which was also signaling, at least in my heart, a new direction for the band. So now I come in, and the band has decided to, for whatever reason, to now break up or something, or melt away, and I'm a Duran fan. That couldn't happen to me. That was just impossible. So I stepped in as the guitar player. So now I am in Duran Duran, so to speak, and I have to be a brother, a fan, a friend, and the producer, and to sort of keep it all together and override or overcome, which is probably a better word, whatever emotional turmoil is going on between the guys, because these are people who are friends and they've changed the world with their music. So I decided, all right, how do I supplement the band and bring in a new sound that's worthy of the next iteration of Duran Duran? So I bring in the Borneo Horns, Steve Peroni, who actually wound up going out on tour with them after the record was done, one of my favorite drummers of all time. And I just thought to myself, so how do I make it so that Duran Duran is on a sort of even playing field? You have to have new people that you bring into the situation that they have to embrace. They have to trust my judgment. But also now I'm sort of in the band. I'm the guitar player. And all I can say is that the guys really rose to the occasion, everybody. And myself as a guitar player, being the guitar player of a band that I sort of looked at as my second band. I look upon the guys in Duran Duran really as my second sheep.
I think it was, I was ready to walk out of the door at that point, and I think it was a huge feeling of relief, actually, because I really wanted to go in a different direction with my life at that point, and I was really happy that the band was going to carry on, and there was going to be Duran Duran that would hopefully project into the future. I had no idea whether it was going to be successful, whether it was going to be the same kind of music. I had no idea what the future held for Duran Duran, but I was happy that the name was going to continue.
I knew that Roger wasn't going to be coming back. I remember going to visit him in Gloucestershire and, having lunch with him. And, I did the same number on him that Nick had done on me a couple of months earlier. We're stronger together. Come on, this is going to be the one. Let's give it the old college try. But I drove away thinking, he's done. He's not coming back. And Andy was different. Andy was quite manipulative in the way he sort of left the band. He was very unclear in how he very manipulative, and so we didn't really know whether we had an Andy or not. And this is always this aspect of what went down is always interesting, given how today's media influences information coming into our lives. And we were working, Simon, Nick and I, by this point we're in a studio in London, and we're starting to build up the tracks and starting to find the direction for the new music, but still waiting on Andy. Now Andy's living in Los Angeles at this time, and then we get word. Actually, I think Warren Cucurullo called the studio and got put through to our tour manager, who was there at the time, and said, I want to talk to the guys in Duran. I'm the guy for them. I'm their next guitar player. And I forget exactly how it went down, whether I feel like we were like, who is this guy? What the cheek of it? We've got a guitar player. And then it transpired, I don't know whether we got on the phone to him or whatever, then it transpired that Andy was playing around the LA area, that he formed a band, that he got a record deal, and he had a band, and he formed this band with Sari and Patrick from Missing Persons, and Steve Jones, oddly enough. And so they were like a band. The Andy Taylor Band was up and open for business, and and so Warren knew he was done with Duran and that we would be needing a new guitar player, but we didn't know that at the time, so it was kind of crazy.
Mate, I tell you something. The hardest thing about making the album Notorious was the fact that Andy and Roger were in the process of leaving the band at the time. Roger, we pretty well knew quite early on that he wasn't going to do it, but Andy was messing us around, really messing us around. I mean, we had a meeting we had meetings in darkened rooms. It was really bizarre. And then I finally went and drove out to the west of England to talk to him, to see if we could get him back on the project. I really believed we could get him back on the project. I think Nick and John really thought that, no, he's already made up his mind, he's leaving. I was the one who's holding on the longest. It was tough. It did make it difficult. It made the whole artistic process quite difficult, because we'd be having lawyers' meetings at sort of, 10 o'clock in the morning, and they'd go on, and then Nile would come and go, all right, guys, come on, time to get the lawyers out. You've got to do some work, and we'd start on the music. It was bizarre, but we sort of got on with it, really. It was hard to just leave that whole kind of, because it was really a big pile of shit that we were going through. And it was very hard to leave that behind and get your head into creative mode.
What was amazing was how Simon, Nick, and I were galvanized, and we'd been separated, really. We'd taken these different paths. I'd formed Power Station, Simon and Nick had done Arcadia, and for a while there it was pretty sketchy, and there were these two separate camps, and we weren't really we weren't really getting along with each other. But but what happened, and it's a life lesson that I've carried with me, was suddenly it was us against them, and we were reduced to this 3-man situation, and we were very much, our backs were against the wall, and it's one of those, there's been a few times in the band's career where we've kind of assumed that that our history was gonna automatically sort of open certain doors, or we thought we just got to finish this album, and we felt excited about the sound, Notorious, the song Notorious, Skin Trade. We felt there were some really good songs on the album, and we'd really find the sound of the band in a really cool way. But I think it was the way that we just became so close, as a result of what went down. I mean, Andy in particular led us on such a chase that any differences that we'd had, we were, that put us in the same team. And that was really, that was kind of great. But it was challenging, it was challenging to take the album out and, try to play catch up a little bit. I mean, we needed to do what we needed to do. We've always, whatever this band has had to do over the years, has chosen to do over the years, that hasn't always been, maybe seems to be not necessarily the most astute move, but we've had to do it for whatever reasons. Bands are, the sum of their parts, and sometimes you have to go off in certain directions that, don't always seem the most sensible, but we had to do what we had to do. And, and that album sort of, it did a lot for us, and it's been a very, Notorious in particular has been a song that, we've gotten so much out of over the years. And you realize when you look back over your catalog of albums, that sometimes an album, if it's just got one great song that goes into the canon, you're lucky, because not every album even has one song that is, unforgettable.
I remember when we started the Notorious project, John and I had gone into a studio to demo a few pieces and see what kind of sound we were making together. And when we started naming them, we didn't want titles that would necessarily stick, because that's always a thing for artists. When you get a new piece of music and you decide you need to call it something, there's a danger that you may end up sticking with a name that you don't really want, but because it's there, you almost feel obliged to use that in the actual song itself. So we thought, well, if we name them all after Alfred Hitchcock films, we're never going to end up using all those titles. So we went through them, and one was Notorious, another one was Vertigo, another one was The Man Who Knew Too Much, and etc. And I think we had about 6 or 7 of them, all named after Hitchcock films. But of course, what inevitably happened is that we played some of the ideas back, and Notorious seemed like such a good title, as did Vertigo. Simon added Do the Demolition, but 2 stuck, the others didn't. But it's a testament to how good Alfred Hitchcock's film titles were, and how we appropriated those titles innocently at first by not ever thinking we would end up using them, but how they became not just songs, but in the case of Notorious, the title track of the album, and of course the whole project.
I was pretty content where I personally was at that point. I was, I was glad to be doing what I was doing, and I was happy to hear that the guys were continuing. and I just remember that the time of the year was beautiful where I was living, and I was really content at the time. And it was good to hear that they were still making great records, and a very different sounding record. It was so different from anything Duran had made before. I think it was all about the groove and the funk, and it wasn't necessarily. It didn't have the same structure as a lot of the Duran stuff. It was very different sounding, which I thought was great.
Oh, I think it's a fantastic album. I really do. Notorious is a white funk classic. And has been cited as such by some very serious music business people. I think. What else? I can't remember what else was on the album, to be honest with you. Oh, Skin Trade. Skin Trade's magnificent. I'd like to mention American Science. I think American Science. I remember I was lying. I wrote that in a hospital bed. I was lying. I had a medical procedure, and I was lying in a hospital bed writing the lyrics to that song. I loved it, actually. Really good song.
Well, I'd just come off the back of working with Tony Thompson, and Tony was really challenging to me. And after Tony, Steve was like, it was a dream in a way, because Steve had all the power of Tony, but he was more locked in, a lot more consistent. He was English. He was sort of easier for me to work with. And I'd met Steve at the power station. And I heard him, actually, before I met him. I remember they were cutting tracks. It was a Mick Jagger's solo album. And I heard Steve playing through the door, and I was like, wow, who is that? And was introduced to Steve, and, we got along. And I said to Steve, I want you to be our drummer. And, he got quite excited about that. And, and he took the journey with us. But, we kind of decided after all was said and done that Simon, Nick, and I would continue as a trio. I think I would have sort of replaced it. If it had been up to me, I think I would have brought Steve in, brought Warren in, and straight out, represented the band as a 5-piece, but like as a new 5-piece. But Simon and Nick didn't want to do that. They didn't feel that. They just didn't want to bring in these guys that they barely knew, and and put them in the photographs, and put them on the cover of the record.
Having recorded the third album over 3 different continents, we thought we would try to simplify matters a little when we started work on Notorious. In fact, it was all done in New York and London and Paris. So not 3 continents, but only 3 cities. We worked with Nile Rodgers throughout the whole album. He was a real inspiration, and we were working on his territory. It was funk. Previously, he'd come over to our side of electronica and pop rock music, but we were very firmly in his area. So it was an experiment for us, but I think something that worked really, really well. And we were in different rooms. We were in Studio Davout in Paris. We were in Air Studios in London, and we were in Skyline Studios in New York. And each room sounded very different. We recorded a lot of the drums actually at Air, but we did do some of the drums at Abbey Road, which obviously is very famously known for the Beatles recordings. We used the very big studio there, Studio One, where they record orchestras. And we got such an enormous drum sound that we had to gate it down to manage it within the tracks. But that sound is particularly on tracks like Skin Trade, and one of my favorite drum patterns that Steve Ferroni came up with on So Misled. And I remember standing in that room in the middle of Abbey Road thinking, this is the largest drum sound I have ever heard in my entire life, and it is never going to fit on a record. But, hey, records around, and drums around, and somehow it fitted.
I mean, it was a bit of a surprise to me that we went off in the funky direction. I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised, because that's what you get when you take Nile Rodgers on board, of course. But it was, it was patently obvious that we were going in that direction very quickly. But then, on the other hand, we've had songs like "Last Chance on the Stairway," and even I think not friends of mine so much. New Religion was definitely in that kind of direction. So we knew we had it in us, and it was. As soon as you heard the music that you were making, you didn't think about anything else because it was so good. I mean, they were really. I mean, we came up with Notorious very early on in the sessions, and that set a standard. That set the bar really for the rest of the album. And the last thing on our minds was how the fans would receive it, because we thought it was great.
Winter Marches On is really one of my favorite Duran songs, one of my favorite productions of all time. And I think it speaks to a place in my heart as an artist and as a producer. I was extremely moved by the fact that Duran is a band from England. And as a music student, I've always been interested in sort of the Renaissance period and also English folk music, the way that it's developed after that. At least from my point of view, we tried to make the song poetic, musical, spiritual, if I could use that word, and also cultural. At least as a producer, I was trying to bring out a side of Duran Duran that I believed is sort of hidden to the public, but they do it very well, and they had done it earlier on in their careers when they played ocarina on certain songs and things like that, and that's really why I was sort of coming from. I was trying to respect the tradition of the country and the culture, and still do something that was sort of progressive and forward.
So it was. I mean, we really. Because myself and John and Nick were kind of under pressure, we were sort of under attack in a way from somebody from circumstances, and also from somebody who had been in the band and was being difficult, i.e. Andy. And I think that really was what informed the relationship that we had. We definitely kind of stuck together, and we were very supportive of each other. It was a great time actually for our friendship.
Out of my head as the winter morning.
Hey guys, it's been a great ride, and I can't wait for the next Notorious. Good luck, Duran Duran.